He was a golden boy, a hotshot doctor on a fast track to success. She was a brilliant nurse, her every word a quiet reminder of a world he'd never known, a world he looked down on. He mocked her accent, her mannerisms, her quiet grace. He saw her as a curiosity, a lesser being. He had no idea that one day, his life, his career, his very future would depend on her quiet strength, her unyielding skill, and the very voice he had so carelessly ridiculed. You won't believe the chilling twist of fate that brought him to his knees, begging for her help, and the devastating lesson he learned about the true meaning of humility. In the pristine, high-tech world of St. Luke's Medical Center, a sprawling, state-of-the-art hospital in the heart of Boston, Massachusetts, lived a brilliant young doctor named Ethan Thorne. At 32, he was a neurosurgery resident on the fast track to success, a prodigy with a photographic memory and hands so steady they could perform the most intricate of surgeries with a calm, unyielding precision. He was handsome, charming, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He was a product of a privileged upbringing, a top-tier Ivy League education, and a belief system that told him he was destined for greatness. He saw the world as a ladder, and he was climbing it with a ruthless, singular focus. His father was a renowned surgeon at a prestigious New York hospital, and Ethan had been groomed for this life from birth. He had never known hardship, never faced true failure, and his world was one of manicured lawns, exclusive clubs, and a sense of entitlement that was as vast as the Boston skyline. Ethan's world was meticulously ordered, a world of protocols, procedures, and perfect outcomes. He had a profound, almost pathological, disdain for anything that was less than perfect, less than professional. He saw emotions as a weakness, a distraction from the pursuit of excellence. He saw humanity as a flaw, a messy, unpredictable variable that was an affront to the perfect science of medicine. He believed in a rigid hierarchy of talent and worth, and he placed himself firmly at the top. He had an ego that was as large as his ambition, and he wore it like a tailored suit. He saw people not as individuals, but as functions within a system, and he judged them solely on their utility to his own success. His disdain for otherness was particularly directed at a quiet, brilliant nurse named Maria Lopez. At 35, she was the head of the surgical ward, a master of her craft with a quiet, unyielding grace that was as captivating as it was unsettling to Ethan. She was an immigrant from a small town in rural Mexico, a woman who had worked tirelessly, relentlessly, to earn her place in the hallowed halls of St. Luke's. Her story was one of profound struggle and quiet triumph. She had arrived in the United States as a teenager, speaking no English, with nothing but the clothes on her back and an unshakable determination to make something of herself. She had worked as a cleaner, a waitress, and a cashier, saving every penny, studying English and medical textbooks in the late hours of the night. She had put herself through nursing school, her mind a steel trap of medical knowledge, her heart a wellspring of compassion. Her English was impeccable, her knowledge of medicine was profound, but her voice held a soft, lilting accent, a gentle, melodic rhythm that was a constant, quiet reminder of a world he'd never known, a world he looked down on. Ethan saw her as an anachronism, a relic from a different world, a world of dusty villages and simple lives. He would mock her accent, her quiet mannerisms, her gentle way of speaking. He would make snide, casual remarks about her quaint way of doing things, her unrefined approach to medicine, her charming but unprofessional way of talking. He would tell his colleagues, with a cruel, easy laugh, "It's like listening to a telenovela. It's so dramatic." His colleagues, a mix of sycophants and people who were simply afraid of him, would laugh along with him, their laughter a sharp, ugly sound in the quiet corridors of the hospital. Maria, with her usual quiet dignity, simply ignored him. She never responded to his taunts. She never complained. She would simply nod, her face a mask of quiet composure, and she would continue to do her work, her hands a blur of motion, her mind a steel trap of medical knowledge. Her silence, however, was not a sign of weakness, but a shield, a quiet defiance that only added to Ethan's irritation. He saw her silence as a sign of her low status, a sign of her powerlessness. He saw her quiet dignity as a sign of her submission. He was, in his own mind, a winner, and she was a loser. He was a champion of his own world, and she was an unwelcome intruder. The hospital was a bustling, chaotic world, and Maria was the quiet, unyielding eye of the storm. She was a master of her craft, a woman who could anticipate a doctor's needs before they even knew them, a woman who could read a patient's chart with the precision of a seasoned detective. She was revered by the other nurses, and even the senior doctors respected her quiet authority. But Ethan, in his arrogance, saw her as a servant, a tool to be used, a person who existed only to serve his needs. He would demand things from her, his voice a sharp, impatient command. He would dismiss her suggestions, her quiet words of wisdom, as irrelevant. He was a man who saw the world in black and white, in a simple, unyielding equation of success and failure. He was a man who had never been humbled, and he was about to learn a lesson that would change his life forever. One brisk, winter morning, a day that promised new beginnings, Ethan was on his way to work, a rare sense of peace settling over him. He was a few blocks from the hospital, his mind a blur of surgical procedures and upcoming presentations, when it happened. A car, a blur of metal and glass, ran a red light and crashed into his car, a low-slung, high-tech sports car that was a testament to his success. The world went black. He woke up to the sound of sirens, the smell of burning rubber, and a pain so profound, so devastating, that it felt like his body was on fire. He was trapped in the wreckage of his car, his legs twisted at an unnatural angle, his face a canvas of blood and cuts. He felt a deep, aching terror, a primal fear that he had never known before. He was no longer a doctor. He was no longer a winner. He was a patient, a victim, a broken man. The man who had once been in control was now utterly, completely, helpless. The paramedics arrived, their faces a mask of quiet professionalism. They worked with a calm, unyielding precision, their hands a blur of motion. They strapped him to a gurney, their voices a low, comforting hum. He was a patient, a name on a chart, a broken body to be fixed. He was no longer Ethan Thorne, the hotshot doctor. He was a nameless, faceless victim of a car crash. He was a number, a series of injuries, a case to be managed. He was humbled, stripped of his identity, of his power, of his dignity. The world he had so meticulously ordered, the world he had so carefully controlled, had come crashing down in a single, brutal moment. He was rushed to St. Luke's Medical Center, the place he had once called his kingdom. He was a king who had been deposed, a champion who had been humbled. He was wheeled through the emergency room, the familiar faces of his colleagues a blur of shock and concern. He was taken to the surgical ward, the place he had once ruled, the place he had once mocked. And there, waiting for him, was Maria Lopez. She was a vision of quiet power, a woman who exuded confidence from every pore. She was dressed in her crisp, white nurse's uniform, her face a mask of calm, professional composure. She looked at him, and in her eyes, he saw no judgment, no anger, no resentment. He saw only a quiet, profound kindness. She was not a stranger. She was a professional. She was a hero. She walked up to his gurney, her hands a blur of motion, her voice a soft, gentle whisper. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice filled with a profound, unyielding compassion. "We have you. You're going to be all right. We're going to take care of you." Ethan's world imploded. He looked at her, his face a mask of disbelief. He saw the woman he had once ridiculed, the woman he had once looked down on, the woman who was now his lifeline, his only hope. He saw the face of the woman he had so carelessly mocked, the woman who was now his savior. He saw Maria Lopez, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was no longer a winner. He was a loser. He was a patient, a victim, a broken man. And he had no one to blame but himself. He had built his world on a foundation of arrogance, on a belief that he was above everyone else, and now, that world had come crashing down, leaving him a broken, humbled man. He looked at her, his eyes welling up with tears. He had no words. He had no pride. He had no dignity. He was a broken man, and she was his only hope. He looked at her, and he saw not a person, but an angel. He saw not a nurse, but a healer. He saw not a woman with a quaint accent, but a woman with a kind, unyielding heart. He looked at her, and he knew, with a profound, aching despair, that he was utterly, completely, wrong. The arrogance that had once defined him, the pride that had once sustained him, all of it crumbled into dust. He was a man who had judged a person by their accent, and now, his life, his career, his very future, depended on the quiet, unyielding strength of that person. He felt a deep, aching shame, a shame that was far worse than any physical pain. The next few hours were a blur of pain, of doctors and nurses, of needles and IVs. Maria was a constant, quiet presence by his side. She was his guide, his confidant, his lifeline. She held his hand, she talked to him, her voice a soft, melodic hum that was a soothing balm to his shattered body and his broken spirit. She was a professional, a master of her craft, a woman who moved with a quiet, unyielding grace. She was a healer, a woman who had come to heal not just his body, but his soul. She was not just a nurse, she was a beacon of hope in a world that had suddenly become dark and terrifying. He was taken into surgery, and as he was wheeled into the operating room, he looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet, unyielding plea. "Maria," he whispered, his voice a raw, desperate gasp. "Please, don't let me die. Please." Maria simply nodded, her eyes filled with a profound, unyielding kindness. "I won't," she whispered. "I won't. I promise." Her voice, once so carelessly ridiculed, was now a promise, a sacred vow, a lifeline. Her accent, once a source of his cruel amusement, was now a source of his comfort. He had no pride, no ego, no dignity left. He was a man who had been humbled, a man who had been broken, a man who was now at the mercy of the very person he had once so carelessly mocked. Ethan's surgery was long, difficult, and fraught with complications. He was a doctor, and he knew the risks. He knew that his legs, his hands, his career, his life, were all on the line. He knew that his future was in the hands of the surgeons, the nurses, the healers, the people he had once looked down on. He knew that his fate was in the hands of the very people he had once so carelessly mocked. The irony was not lost on him. He, the great Ethan Thorne, the hotshot neurosurgeon, was now a broken body, a patient, a victim. He had been brought down, not by a rival, not by a mistake, but by his own arrogance, by his own cruelty, by his own profound, unyielding sense of superiority. He woke up in the recovery room, his body a canvas of pain, his mind a blur of drugs and exhaustion. He opened his eyes, and he saw her. She was sitting by his bedside, her face a mask of quiet exhaustion, her hands, once so dirty, now clasped in a gesture of quiet prayer. She looked at him, and a small, gentle smile touched her lips. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice a soft, melodic hum. "You're going to be all right." Ethan looked at her, his heart overflowing with a gratitude that words could never express. He had been a loser, a broken man, a victim, and she had been his savior. She had been his hero. She had been his lifeline. She had been the quiet, unyielding presence that had guided him through the darkness. He recovered, slowly, painfully, but with a new sense of purpose, a new sense of humility. He learned to walk again, to use his hands again, to be a doctor again. But he was a different doctor now. He was a doctor who saw people not as assets, but as human beings. He was a doctor who saw people not as titles, but as stories. He was a doctor who saw people not as objects to be fixed, but as souls to be healed. He was no longer a winner. He was no longer a loser. He was a human being, a man who had been broken and had been remade, a man who had learned the hard, brutal lesson of humility. He went to Maria's office, a small, unassuming room filled with books and files. He walked in, his heart pounding in his chest. "Maria," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry. For everything. For what I said, for what I did. I was a terrible person. I was a jerk. I hope you can forgive me." Maria simply looked at him, her eyes filled with a profound, unyielding kindness. She didn't say a word. She simply reached out her hand, and she clasped his. Her hands, once so dirty, were now a symbol of her strength, her kindness, her quiet grace. He held her hand, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he had been forgiven. He had been given a second chance. He had been given a chance to be a better person. Ethan Thorne, the hotshot doctor, was now a different man. He was a doctor who saw people not as patients, but as human beings. He was a doctor who saw people not as titles, but as stories. He was a doctor who saw people not as objects to be fixed, but as souls to be healed. He had learned that true strength was not in a title, but in a kind heart. He had learned that true dignity was not in a perfect accent, but in a quiet, unyielding grace. He had learned that true wealth was not in money, but in the love you gave, and the lives you touched. He had walked into the hospital as a winner, and he had walked out as a human being. And in that moment, he knew that he was finally, truly, free. He had found redemption, not in a surgical procedure, not in a perfect outcome, but in the quiet, profound act of humility. He had found his true self, not in a title, but in a kind heart. He had been humbled, but he had been healed. He had been broken, but he had been remade. He had lost everything, but he had gained something far more valuable, his humanity. This story is a powerful reminder that we never know who we are talking to. It's a reminder that a single act of cruelty can come back to haunt you in the most unexpected ways. It's a reminder that true humility is not about being humble, but about being human. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of the power of forgiveness. Like and subscribe for more stories that will change your perspective and remind you that sometimes, the most valuable lessons are the ones that are learned in the hospital.